Elmoville, Morrisville, and Rawdon. Though many local residents can trace their lineage back to these towns, they are now long forgotten. Though evidence still exists on old road signs and overgrown foundations, these towns faded into oblivion simply because they lacked a connection to efficient and economic transportation, the railroad, which was vital to the survival of small towns throughout our county, and the struggle for survival isn't over yet. Every town still in existence in JoDaviess County was established near some form of transportation in order to ship goods to major cities such as Chicago and Dubuque. These forms of transportation ranged from rivers to railroads and finally to highways. Small farming communities needed a way to get their goods to places where they could sell them for top dollar. The river boats and railroads provided such a service. There were two main railroad systems that serviced JoDaviess. They were the Illinois Central Railroad and the Chicago Great Western.
Galena is proof that having sources of transportation that connect to other communities can make a town prosper. Galena, at one time, had 4 railroads and a river run through it and is now the largest town in JoDaviess. Unfortunately, other communities were not as fortunate. The lack of resources made villages such as Morrisville obsolete. Towns like Elizabeth, Stockton, and Scales Mound, while still connected to the railroads, they were not linked to the same degree as Galena. They each had but one link to the world outside of their own. This may explain why each of these communities still exists, but their populations are a fraction of that of Galena.
Galena is by far the most dominant town in this area. The river is one of the reasons for its success.
I think by the Civil War days, there was quite a bit of farming going on in the county. And so it kind of rivaled the lead mining that was going on. And of course now with the farming, they needed a way to transportation. There would be communities that were a little further out that didn't have access to the river. So when the Illinois Central came through the county in the early 1850s, 1853 and 4,
the railroad eventually grew because farmers needed to ship crops and livestock. Local historians have researched these abandoned towns for many years. As a local writer and historian, Bob Hess is an expert on the relationship between the trains and the towns. He explains why these towns were built where they were.
When they was going to put the boundaries for the state, they figured at first they would go from the bottom of Lake Michigan and run the line west.
Unfortunately, there were some arguments over Lake Michigan. They eventually agreed to place the state boundaries on a line of longitude.
So they argued a while, and then they finally put it on. I think it's on some line, you know, what do they call them? The lines on the longitude and latitude, and I think that's where it went. And that's why Chicago. Otherwise, Chicago would have been in Wisconsin.
He also explains why the towns were built where they were.
Why were they built? Transportation. You know, that's the key to it all, was transportation. Why are all the towns like Warren, Apple River, Nora?
The first railroad to come through JoDaviess County ran through two towns by the names of Morrisville and Pitcherville. Pitcherville was directly north of the railroad, while Morrisville was a few miles south. Pitcherville, being the closer of the two, was later picked up and moved to the railroad because the residents realized the power that the railroad brought.
Just north of town, it actually is a church. You know where the library is now? There was a church there, and they had moved that in from Pitcherville. But that one was up there about damn near a mile, I found out.
Once Pitcherville was moved, it became a large stockyard. Here, farmers were able to take their livestock to the trains to be sold and shipped to be butchered. It was because of this that Pitcherville evolved into the village of Stockton, which still thrives today.
There's no railroad, there's no stockyards. That was one business. It made it good for the farmers to sell their livestock.
The railroad had affected individual businesses in each town as well. An example of such a business was the Great Western Hotel in Stockton. Most of its income came in because of the men who worked on the railroad of the hotel's namesake.
And that one railroad men stayed at all the time, you know. And see, they'd stay over the crew.
Another town in JoDaviess County was, and still is, Elizabeth. However, Elizabeth was not always alone in its location. There were once two other towns around where Elizabeth still stands. They were Weston and Georgetown.
The one village to the west of Elizabeth, about 3 miles, was Weston. It was a mining community. And in 1849, when they discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in California, most of these lead miners decided that they could make more money mining gold in California. And almost overnight, that village of Weston almost totally disappeared. The people who were left gravitated eventually into the bottomland of the Apple River. They built a dam, established a mill, and the houses down there in the bottomland were called Georgetown.
Town, unfortunately, experienced major flooding because it was right on the river. This obviously created a problem for the inhabitants. So, as a result, many of them decided to move to their neighboring community of Elizabeth, which was located just up the hill from Georgetown.
In 1888, the Chicago Great Western Railway came through, and as a result, it said that what was left of Georgetown, literally the buildings were disassembled and moved up the hill.
But after all the good fortune these small towns still had in surviving, their luck is being tried once again. Plans are being discussed to build a 4-lane highway to bypass most of the towns in JoDaviess County. There are many different opinions on how this would affect the towns. Most, like Jerry Spear, Steve Rupp, and longtime Galena resident Madeline Wilharm, think this would be harmful to the towns and businesses it would avoid.
We could look into the future and consider a project that's being discussed. There have been surveys for a bypass to the north of Elizabeth, and in my opinion, if that ever happens, you will have a need for yet another transition, because with the traffic bypassing the town, the tourist destinations will be greatly impacted by this, and if another focus isn't found, in my opinion at least, the town would decline significantly.
As far as a 4-lane highway through JoDaviess County, I don't think that it will be that beneficial. I think that some of the towns will suffer by that because they'll be bypassed, and their economies will not do very well because of this so-called progress. I think that they're very dependent upon the traffic coming through their town, and if it's bypassed in any way, that will have a detrimental effect on them.
The effect of the 4-lane on the smaller towns in JoDaviess County, in my opinion, would be detrimental, mostly because a lot of these towns depend on the traffic and people saying, oh, what a unique shop, what a unique place to stop, something like that. And so if there's a 4-lane and they don't have that opportunity where they would bypass the town, then a lot of those businesses would go away.
But for now, these towns continue to endure. Each and every establishment was challenged throughout their existences. Some towns were made by these challenges, and others were broken. While the railroad was not the only deciding element in whether or not these towns continued, like with the small town of Rawdon, which had a station but eventually disappeared into nothingness, it, with the rivers and highways, still played major roles. Whether these towns' existence is attributed to rivers or railroads, they still affect the lives of both JoDaviess residents and tourists.